Salam. Welcome to the Logic of the Birds podcast. Today, I have with me to discuss the works of Rumi, Professor Fatemeh Keshavarz, Professor and Director of the Roshan Institute of Persian Studies, and a professor and old teacher of mine, James Morris, Professor at Boston College. Welcome, and thank you very much for being with us here today. I wanted to start by asking each of you a little bit about your relationship to Rumi and his poetry. What attracted you to this poetry? And what have you come to appreciate about it over time? Let's start with you, Professor Keshavarz.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you for having me to begin with. It's always a pleasure to speak about Rumi, and particularly about my relationship with Rumi. I was born in the city of Shiraz in southwest of Iran in a family in which two things were the most important things. One was playing chess and the other one was poetry. And so I grew up hearing a lot of poetry of these master poets, and both my parents were Sufis. So the road to Rumi was a very natural road. There were aspects of his poetry that I didn't need to really read in books because in conversations between the members of the family happened. For example, if two people were not on good friendly terms, somebody will quote the line, "To baraye wasl kardan amadi." You're here in order to connect. So, reminding people that they should forget about things that are not important and stay connected with each other. So a lot of poetry of Rumi, I basically absorbed in that way and very much enjoyed and considered it to be just very normal part of life until I started my formal education and I started writing my own, in some ways, childish poetry at the time. And then I started really exploring these poets in writing. And I was, again, very, very lucky that my father was probably the best teacher of poetry I've ever had. Without having read any literary theory, he would give the most in-depth, and fun analysis of poems. And so we did start having those arguments from early on and agreed and disagreed and so on. But it was always about poetry, and Rumi was very much a part of it. And of course, when I went to university, I continued that. And when I started my own teaching career, thinking about who I want to write on, the first thought was Rumi, because I just simply loved working on his poetry.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And Professor Morris, what was your introduction to Rumi and his poetry?
Well, it's unforgettable to start with, and I certainly didn't have the kind of outward support that Fatemeh just mentioned. But in a course, my second year at the University of Chicago as an undergrad, and I had, it was a course, 3-quarter, really intensive course, Islamic civilization by someone who, a historian who wrote the book, Venture of Islam, and he actually passed away during that year. And there were two things in that course that I'll never forget. They were both in the final quarter at the end of it. One was he gave us some selections from Rumi's Masnavi and Nicholson's translation. And I just want to mention by the side, he didn't even give us to read, but went through a ghazal of Hafez later on in the class. I found both of those it was like with the Rumi, I just woke up to something that it was like the beginning of the world's best detective story. Like, what is the meaning of life, And I don't even remember what part of it. I assume it was something early, but it wasn't the prologue of the Masnavi. And I was I had the same experience with Plato the year earlier, discovering Plato for the first time, the dialogues. And but I was so fascinated and so that I changed my major from Western philosophy to, I was in something called civilizational studies, which gave me a lot of freedom. But I just wanted to figure this mystery out, as I say those words, I always come back to the final book of the Masnavi. How many decades it took me to get to the end of the Masnavi. So, but the odd thing was, it took about 5 years before I was able to get into a class in Persian with Anna Marie Schimmel. And I mean, she wasn't doing the Persian, but she was giving the context for all of this. So it took a long time, but the Arabic and Islamic studies and all that I did before that was really essential for understanding the deeper underpinnings of Rumi. So I didn't waste my time, but it's like with Rumi, it's kind of like, really, it's like a love story when you meet the person you're going to spend your life with, the one, or the Basher, your beloved, your soulmate. I was looking for the word soulmate. So that was for Rumi. Finding Rumi was like a soulmate, experience. I guess Coleman Barks must have had something like that too when he was just studying with Bawa Mahidin, So yeah, so. And I've seen that, by the way. I've seen lots of students through that process since then, really.
Yes, I have a student who was an international studies major and wanted to go to law school. And he took a course that I taught, lyrics of mystical love, East and West. And we discussed Rumi, and he fell in love in Rumi. He came to my office and said, "How can I read more Rumi?" I said, "Do Persian." He said, "I'm a senior." I said, "Well, so what? How old are you?" He took Persian. He's now professor of Persian. He did it. He went all the way through to, master's and PhD. And, it happens. People, that's exactly what Jim said. You want to spend your life with this because there is so much in there. And if I may quote Rumi on this, he is talking, as you know, in Fihi Ma Fi, the discourses of Rumi. He's talking to a group of people. We don't know exactly who, but we assume that most of them are unspecialized. So he's kind of simplifying things in a very beautiful way. And he says, اگر کسی در وقت سخن گفتن ما میخسبد آن خواب از غفلت نباشد. He says, sometimes when I talk, some people fall asleep here. Don't worry. It's not because they are not paying attention. But it is as if همچنان کاروانی در راهی صعب خوف در شب تاریک میرود. And he says that it's like a caravan traveling in a dark night on a difficult road, and everybody is afraid that there is, could be anything happening, thieves, all kinds of people. And then همین که آواز سگ یا خروس به گوش ایشان رسد به ده آمدند و فارغ شدند و پا کشیدند و خفتند. Just as they hear the barking of a dog or sound of the rooster, the cock crowing, they just know that they're near a village, and then they feel safe and they fall asleep. And then says, سخن ما نیز از آبادانی و امن میآید. And my voice comes from a place of safety. و حدیث انبیا و اولیاست. And then it says, it speaks to you of the friends of God and of the prophets. And so it's a voice coming from a place of safety. So no wonder some people feel so comfortable they want to fall asleep. So I think it's that safety we all love so much. And sharing it with the students is one of the greatest pleasures, I must say.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, I've also experienced myself having my life's plans derailed by reading Rumi in a wonderful way. As Professor Morris, as you both kind of mentioned, Rumi was operating in a particular context, and that context is very different in some ways from ours today. So I wanted to ask Professor Keshavarz if you could just give us a brief introduction to Rumi's context, where he was born, where he worked, where he lived, what was the kind of context, so we can kind of better understand his poetry.
Well, Rumi was born in 1207, and it was not actually in the city of Balkh, but it was in a locality called Vakhsh, which was outside the river Bakhshab. It was to the south of Balkh. And so, but really the family was where most activities were happening in the city of Balkh in present-day Afghanistan. And for various reasons, we cannot really go into that much detail about it here, including the fact that the Mongols from Central Asia were coming and conquering these areas, and also certain other disagreements or issues that were going on at Balkh for his father, who was a very distinguished mystical and religious figure himself, Baha'u'llah. So they decided to migrate, and we think Rumi was somewhere between the age of 5 or 6 to 9 at most, and they went all the way to the west, went through some of the biggest urban, like mega cities in the Muslim world, such as Nishabur, such as Samarkand, such as Baghdad in present-day Iraq. And so I wouldn't be surprised if seeing all of these amazing places also made Rumi understand the complexity of cultures and how everything was not what they recognized and realized and learned within the family or their school. And then they finally settled in central Anatolia in the city of Konya. And it's interesting that Baha'u'llah's father was offered a mosque, and he asked for a school to be built for him. And that was done, and they settled in there. And Rumi was very much a person close to his father. With his brothers, he traveled to Damascus to study when he was pretty young. And then when his father died, he was only 25, but he was a natural successor to his father. So it says something about the way the community felt about him. And he was in that role of teaching and preaching and basically being a school teacher until he met Shams, which has its own story, and I think we should leave that for maybe a separate conversation.
Wonderful. It strikes me as very interesting. Rumi, in some ways, was a migrant, and his family were migrants. So even refugees crossing all of these borders, going to different places, and under the tutelage of his father and other people, he was already a Sufi as well as a scholar and an alim and a teacher in Konya. But then, as you kind of alluded, something happened. We all talk about Rumi and his poetry now because of this encounter with this enigmatic figure, Shamsuddin Tabrizi. Professor Morris, can you pick up the thread there and tell us a little bit about Shams and what his meeting with Rumi was like?
Wow. Well, I can talk about it from the outside, but from the inside, fortunately, I think in almost everyone's life, if you should live so long, everyone will have an encounter which is as unexpected as Rumi's encounter with Shams. Now, the odd thing is there's so much mythology and so many stories that are told about that encounter, and they're well-intentioned, but I think the main thing is Shams was a wandering spiritual teacher and guide, of which every culture and civilization has such people. He was never satisfied to just sit and teach, either in a Sufi context or another one. But we have some students' notes that are translated in several translations. We'll probably come back to that. I think a very important book because it kind of gives you a sense of the inside of the transformation that Shams brought about in Rumi. But he's somebody who only settled for the real thing. Shams was for real spiritual attainment. So you can't label him as a Sufi or a dervish or calendar or whatever, because that was his essential purpose in life. And he would go around looking for people who could, maybe that he could just communicate with, because we all know that when we meet somebody, whatever their gender or background or whatever, who really understands us, you just want to spend your time with that person. And for whatever reason, Shams represented that for Rumi and vice versa. And so Rumi, before and after Shams, like before he was a professor, he's widely respected because of his father. Primarily, he was seen as an important teacher. But it's just like anybody who's professor in a university setting, say of religious studies or something, would be the equivalent roughly of what he was doing in madrasas there. And then when he met Shams, it was like it just unlocked some connection with the higher world, with God, whatever you want to call it, in a way that his poetry, in fact, it wasn't so much that he wrote a lot of poetry. He wrote poetry, and we have some of his younger poetry, and it's nothing special. But then it was really when Shams kind of went away, whether, again, the stories say he was driven away or he chose to leave, but he missed him so much that somehow that he began to pull out this poetry, and he began to reflect on what did he really learn from this encounter with Shams, and why did that happen? And that essential emotional drive of trying to understand the purpose of this encounter, it's there from the beginning to the end of all of his famous poems. And what changes is that at first it's very emotional and very direct, and anybody who's been in love can read many of the ghazals, the short love poems, and in translation, or better yet in Persian. But this Masnavi, which he devoted the last decades of his life to, is a kind of what I always like to compare to is Dante and Beatrice. The whole Dante's Divine Comedy is sort of his homage to her, and she guides him and everything. Well, she was dead. she wasn't around to in this world to be that kind of guide. But whether he calls Shams or he talks about the sun or the beloved or whatever, throughout the Masnavi, he's always in this, just reflecting on everything that Shams has taught him. So I think any time you're really transformed by love of someone that you meet, whether in this world or through a book or through music, it doesn't have to be physical. Then you will love Rumi because he captures the overwhelming transformation of the soul that just comes when somebody opens up another world to you.
I think, if I may, I would like to highlight the point you made, that the point is not to uncover what Shams was or who Shams was. Rumi doesn't want to do that either. He's like, خود غریبی در جهان چون شمس نیست. There's nothing or nobody in the world who's that strange, that undefinable. But Qarib could also be in someone who's lonely and doesn't belong. So he does point to how unusual and exceptional he is, but he never tells us who he is. And elsewhere he says, خوشتران باشد که سر دلبران گفته آید در حدیث دیگران. The way to do this is to talk about that love through some other means, not by trying to unravel it. And if I might quote Shams himself, I think he actually wants that. He has these 3 lines that struck me so hard when one day I started to think about it differently. He says, آن یار سه گونه خط نوشتی. That beloved, obviously the higher truth of God, that beloved wrote 3 kinds of scripts. یکی را او خواندی ولا غیر. One of these scripts he could read, other people couldn't. یکی را هم او خواندی و هم غیر. There was one script that he could read and everybody else could read. یکی را نه او خواندی نه غیر او. There was a script that neither he could read nor anybody else. آن خط سوم منم. That third script, I am that third script. And for years and years, I thought, what do you mean? How could that beloved write a script that he cannot read? And then one day, I was suddenly struck. This is a script that is being rewritten all the time. That is why nobody can read it, because he's in the constant process of recreation or khalq mujaddad which is really what the ideal that they're talking about. And so in that sense, Shams doesn't want to be known either. He wants to be for people that changing entity that they can connect with as they grow on their journey and their efforts and so on. And then it's very interesting that Rumi uses his name as his pen name, because at some point he identifies with him. And then there are times when you can actually tell that he's gone beyond Shams. He has internalized them. He has used that, he has them there, but he is able now to travel beyond, which I think is quite fascinating.
Yes, that's a wonderful point. Thank you. Shams being kind of like a mirror. Nobody's ever seen the surface of a mirror, as Rumi points out, and other Sufis. The surface of the mirror is completely unknown, and yet it's what makes our own faces visible to us. So thank you so much for this wonderful. I learned so much about this context of Rumi and Shams. And then so Shams finally leaves, and so he leaves once, then he comes back, then he leaves again. And Rumi's really distraught and can't find him. And so first, if I'm getting this right, first he writes the Divan-i Shams, the Kuliyat, this massive collection of ghazals, I don't know, 30,000, I don't know how many thousands of verses.
35,000, yeah. Right.
35,000 verses. And then later on, he starts writing the Masnavi, which he's dictating to another disciple, Husamuddin. And the Masnavi is, as you said, it's kind of like the Divine Comedy. It's this massive collection, 6 volumes, which he writes over, I don't know how many, a decade or so. Can you tell us about the composition of the Masnavi? So we have some sense now of the composition of all these wonderful ghazals, either in Shams's name or kind of inspired by love of Shams. But how did the Masnavi come about? This thing that was called the Qur'an in Persian.
Well, I think that there was a sense that Rumi began to feel that, well, he's getting close to the later stages of his life. And I think the ghazals continued to come and happen all the time, all the way through. Even there are ghazals that must have been written just before he passed. But because he speaks about his death, and he speaks about, that now you can leave me, now let me just be here. And then he speaks about that process. So the ghazals, I think, are a continued, like a river, it's impossible for him to stop it. He does talk about that سخن منقاد من نمی شود. He says, I want to control my words, but I sometimes can't do that. But the Masnavi is a kind of self-conscious attempt to put these in a systematic and as deep and really not that much colored by emotion, although he does have in the middle of them, every few pages you get something that's really a ghazal, is full of emotion. And so it's his way of giving interpretations of various verses of the Qur'an. It is his way of referring to some learning from other traditions, but also using parables, telling stories, which you can't do in ghazal, because it really is not a narrative structure, and it's also too short. So, but in a Masnavi, he can give you this long story and give you different interpretations of it. It's very interesting. Sometimes he gives one interpretation, and then later on he goes against it. It kind of refutes what he had said earlier. It's a tremendous example of not becoming a prisoner of your own learning. That an attempt to continue to learn, continue to question. And so he has these also very small circle of students and companions who are there. And so that also gives him, I think Jim pointed out in relation to his connection with Shams, that it's very important to speak to people that you feel can connect with you. And so here, when he composes the Masnavi, those people are there. So the element of being able to speak in a more complicated language, more specialized language, using parables, and also having a sense that that's a dialogue between him and the people around him. I mean, the gems in there, people usually focus on the first few lines, which are about the ney and the flute, or ney player colleagues are going to be now upset to call it a flute because they see it as very different. But anyway, that we are all that ney, that flute instrument that God is playing because he's breathing of his soul in us, which is also a Quranic verse about human creation. So the focus is on there, but there is so much, so many gems. At some point I can give you one or two examples.
Wonderful, thank you. And Professor Morris, could you tell us a bit about the context of some of these ghazals? I've heard what emerged in these sama sessions in which people are playing music, and this was the origin of the kind of whirling dance or ritual of what later became an order, that traced itself back to a Sufi order that traced itself back to Rumi, the Mevlevi order, known in the West as the whirling dervishes. Can you tell us about this kind of ritual context in which Rumi was composing and reciting his poetry?
Yes. First of all, the ritual of sama, or of using music and movement. Dance probably doesn't conjure up exactly what sama is like, but it's almost more like if you have an ambience of almost like a rock festival, in the sense that it's an emotional experience in which the whole group becomes unified. So it's not performance. For me, dance implies a kind of performance. It's not performance. It's like opening oneself up to dimensions of the self that in a way only are openable in that group context of the music and all. So that there's a couple of things that I just think are so important about Rumi's poetry, and certainly, first of all, is that it not only is to music, but in many ways, so much of the divan is music, the ghazals, and you hear it recited. We're fortunate to have Fatemeh here, but in terms of rhythm, in terms of you don't have to know Persian to appreciate that musical quality of his poetry. And there are a couple of things related to that. I just wanted, in case we go past them, I didn't want to leave them alone. And that is that you're talking about this kind of context of ritual, but it's so important to realize that most of the Persian poets that were respected, Persian was kind of a new language, relatively new to start with. To write in Persian, you had to master mostly the Arabic poetic oeuvre. And the people who really sort of were respected and made it were often court poets. So Rumi wasn't a court poet, and that's so important because he was writing on the one hand, for people who, after all, he's a professor of sort of Islamic studies, of adab and Qur'an and all of these things, but he was writing to communicate it to everyone. And the Persian language at that time is much like English is today. It was the lingua franca that, in Konya, where he was for most of his adult life there, it was a border city, if you're going to talk about migrants, where you just walk through the souk and you would hear 4 or 5 important languages of Anatolia. And it stayed that way. And I think that's one of the essential reasons why Rumi is so appealing today, is we live in a world which is much like the world of Konya, if you will, in his time, that it was many religions, and you had Greek Orthodox, Armenian. These were major communities around there, as well as kind of the borders between the Byzantine Empire and the Seljuk Empire were always shifting. And it was much like Andalusia was later on, between different communities. And so the other thing about Persian, because it became a lingua franca in some ways because it's so easy to pick up. People would use it for trade. They would use it for, trade in particular. So it spread very quickly. You could learn it quickly. not at a high level, but you could learn it enough to communicate with other people. So he picked a medium, much like probably people would use music for today, that was international or intercommunal and so forth, to write this poetry. And I'm sure people gave him a hard time. You're a learned scholar. Why are you writing in this everyday dialect? Well, again, it's like Dante, who kind of invented the Italian language, because Latin was what you were supposed to be doing, and Latin and Arabic kind of had similar functions. So because it was spontaneous, I think the ghazals, you can't deny. I mean, you have only to compare his ghazals to almost any other famous Persian poet, and they're all trying to show off their learning and their knowledge and compress as much meaning as they can in each line. Rumi's just like, here it is. It's like a musician who can just improvise. And the Masnavi is another story, because that's later reflective and so forth. But the ghazals are they are music, and they're meant to be accessible in a way that still carries over today. If I can, I just wanted to say that Fatemeh started talking about Persian and people picking up, but Persian is so close to English and other Indo-European languages that almost every time I teach it, people can start reading the rubaiyat, the quatrains, which are short poems. You can spend about a month. I just give a class on top of the poetry class on the language, and people can pick up enough Persian grammar, if they have the translations of it, to actually read the quatrains. I don't know of any other language I could, Chinese or Russian or Japanese or whatever. You couldn't do that, but it's close enough to English in its symbolism, and English. By that I mean Western European languages. That it's very easy to sort of go from one of those languages to Persian and back in a way that, say if you wanted to read learned Arabic poetry or read the Qur'an, you have to spend 3 or 4 years just to get going on it. Whereas with Persian, it's 3 or 4 months. And I remember reading somewhere that Fitzgerald, who sort of brought Persian poetry into English through his translations of Omar Khayyam, that he picked up Persian in 1 month. Oh God, he must have been a linguistic genius. But then once I started learning Persian, I realized, nope, it's compared to Latin or Greek, it's a lot easier. So I don't mean this to go too far aside, but you don't want to imagine this kind of formal Sufi orders as they developed, say, just in the next generation with his son, who founded this Malavi order. You have to imagine things like the fihi ma fihi, that he's just teaching his prose discourses. He's teaching students who are fellow citizens. They're not so much fellow classmates. And so they bring up all the different dimensions of everyday life, and that search to connect what he wants to communicate to everyone's life is something that obviously I think good teachers are kind of try to do that, whatever their subject is. Certainly Rumi did. He must have astonished his fellow professors what's he doing? What's he trying to teach the hoi polloi, the common people? And that he never lost that sense of this burning to communicate what he understood.
Right. I think that, adding to what Jim was saying, one of the other characteristics of Persian is that over the past 1,000 years, it hasn't really gone through dramatic changes, because all the changes happened in Middle Persian and Old Persian, and for thousands of years by the time we get there. Today, on the cover of a first or second year primary school book, is a verse of Ferdowsi, "Tawana بود هر که دانا بود." Whoever is knowledgeable is powerful. And the kids, with the exception of the word "bovad," which is a slightly less everyday and current, the students can read that and understand it. So that was it also gave the Sufis a tremendous tool for reaching the public, where the theologian and the philosopher and all the learned people spoke to a smaller community of experts. The Sufis spoke to a much broader community. I can't let go the point on Sama without saying this and then comparing it to his poetry, if I may. On the Sama, the story is that one day Rumi was passing through the goldsmith market, and as they were working with these little hammers and chisels, and it's very musical if you've ever been in that environment, that he started whirling, which is, as I absolutely agree with Jim, it should not be translated into a dance because it will bring all kinds of other connotations. But he did maintain this notion of being able to use this whirling to go into, and music, to go into a level of connecting with himself and with the outside world, to the point that when his disciple, I think it was Salahuddin Zarqub, had died, and they were taking him to bury him, and he suddenly stops everyone and says, no, this is not the way to do this. Take your instruments out. And he starts dancing and singing and taking him to bury him in, because, of course, that's connection as far as he's concerned. But so he connects that and he feels that in speaking. In Fihi Ma Fihi, at some point says, I am like a pregnant woman whose breasts are filled with milk. پستانهاش قوی پر گشته. And it's so painful that she has to give it. And then she says, if I don't find any people there, I'm going to give it to the puppies of the neighborhood. The sag bachagana mahalle, which is also very loving and kind. So it is it's just like whirling itself. You get into this stage where you have to say it, but you can also see that he sees that as feeding people around him and connecting with them through his words, which I find tremendously ecstatic, really.
That's so beautiful. You really feel that pressure in the ghazals, like it's as if somebody's put their thumb over a hose, and they're just. And I've heard that before Rumi expanded the canon, the classical Persian canon of meters was limited to about 30 some or something like that. And then in Rumi's Divan-i Shams, he expanded the meters to like 50 or some meters as well too. So he's incredibly. These words just had to come out, and however they needed to come out.
It was exactly the same act of turning a funeral into a whirling dance. What he did with the poems was exactly that, making the length short and long if he wanted, adding to the meter, adding to the topics. In his poetry, is like if you are if you make 1,000 homes for yourself like the bees, I am going to make you homeless like a fly. Love is speaking. Bees are there, flies are there, donkeys are there. It's not just nightingale and rose, not to put down there were some grand voices, as I'm sure you all know, prior to Rumi and after Rumi, so I don't want to put them down. But he opens the door. This really is turning a funeral into a whirling dance, and he's such a master of doing that, whether it's actual whirling or in writing poetry.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you. Well, since we're now deep into the poetry, I wanted to ask if you could each share a few of your favorite poems or verses, or talk us through some of the most celebrated or most famous verses, and tell us how they're illustrative of kind of Rumi's broader work, why they're so special, what makes them so beautiful and profound. How does the magic work? Because there's clearly a magic at work in Rumi's poetry that'll make you change your life, that'll make you fall in love, that'll do all of this. How does this work in the poetry? How does this work in some of your favorite verses?
I remember this when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. There was this, when we went to bed and it was summertime and we were putting beds outside in the yard, I was always waiting, and I tried not to fall asleep because there was this wandering dervish. I never saw him because it was night, and he would pass through our alley, and he would recite this most of the time, this line of Sa'di, به جهان خرم از آنم که جهان خرم از اوست عاشقم بر همه عالم که همه عالم از اوست. I am glad in the world because the world is gladdened by him. And I am in love with the world because the world is in love with him. And so, I was 5 years old, but I just loved it. There was so much music, but also safety and kindness in there. So, I cannot thank my city and my parents enough for putting me in such an environment, But going back to what you were asking, Professor Oldamini, I want to, as I told you, there are these gems of lyric poems in between the very learned and highly complex portions of the Masnavi. So I want to recite a couple of lines from there with translations, which are really celebrated, but also need to be celebrated because they're just amazing for the time. So he says, همزبانی خویشی و پیوندی است. مرد با نامحرمان چون بندی است. ای بسا هندو و ترک همزبان. ای بسا دو ترک چون بیگانگان. To speak the same language is to share the same blood, to be related. To live with strangers is a life of captivity. Many are Hindus and Turks who share the same language. Many are Turks who may be alien to each other. پس زبان محرمی خود دیگر است. همدلی از همزبانی بهتر است. So the language of companionship is a unique one. To reach someone through the heart is other than reaching them through words. غیر نطق و غیر ایما و سجل 100,000 ترجمان خیزد ز دل. Besides words, allusions, and arguments, the heart knows 100,000 ways to speak. So to say this in the 1300s, where, there is the war, the invasion, the Mongols, the others, the city of Konya, people are constantly worried about who's going to come in next and so on. To say that a Hindu and a Turk speak to each other the language of their heart, they're closer than two Turks who can't do that, is radical. It's miraculous. And I think we are just lucky to have voices like his, and cultures, I'm sure other cultures do theirs as well.
It's wonderful. I mean, the irony is he's actually doing this heart communication through language, through the tongue, precisely by doing this. It's really, so he's saying there's more than just speech. The heart has these 1,000 ways to connect, but he's doing that through speech itself.
Right, and he actually says that. People are always quoting him saying, "Muftailan kosht mara." I can't write poetry. I'm fed up with meters. But that's all artists. All top artists are always complaining about the limitations of their idiom. But he also says, "She'r man nan Misr ra manad." My poetry is like Egyptian bread, which he must have liked a lot. So elsewhere in the Fi Mafi, he says, it's actually in the Masnavi, he says, I went to the stream of meaning with the jar of my words. And when I put the jar there, I realized that the jar and the stream are the same. So that is Jacques Derrida for you, It's like content and form are not separated. And so he does have really a very complex understanding of language. What he doesn't want you to do is to fall in love with those beauties of strength of poetic games that Jim was referring to, that to show how well you can play these games with language. That's what he doesn't want you to fall in love with, but I think he's very aware of the significance of language.
I think it was Rumi who described his poetry like a cloud before the moon. The moonlight shines through it, but the point is to go through it to get to the moon. Kind of like the old Bruce Lee finger pointing at the moon. If you stay at the finger, you'll miss all the heavenly glory.
With all tools, it's like the Buddha, you get to the end of the river. You don't carry the boat on your head. The boat was there to get you across the river. And he does have you. That's why I think he has these poems that could be totally erotic poetry. And it's like, what? What are you doing? Aren't you a Sufi master? Aren't you? Well, this is what people can experience, can understand at a human level, at a very simple human level. So he gives them all he can give them with language, because we need that in order to go, that cloud, in order to go through towards the moon. And I think he's aware of that as a poet.
Wonderful. Professor Morris, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, yeah, I've got a lot of different thoughts here, and I'm trying to organize them. But one thing I would say is Rumi is easily memorizable in the sense that, like Fatemeh was mentioning, that people think of the Masnavi as a book of stories. Well, in fact, as soon as you start studying it, it's stories and teachings. It's like a sermon with the scripture and the homily all the time, all mixed up together. But it's very important that people remember the stories, so the stories live with them. And likewise with lines, be it of the Divan or quatrains, or that people know those lines. And whenever the situation in life comes up that makes them real, it's very similar to scripture in that function that most people don't have their Bible or their Quran completely memorized, but they recognize the lines when they come up. The Psalms are everywhere in English literature. And I remember one line just popped in my head as you asked this question. It's in the prologue, the famous prologue to the Masnavi, where he says, Hark uz ham zabani shod jada, bi zabani shod garchadarat sadnava. And whoever is separated from someone that they can spiritually communicate with is basically tongue-tied or speechless or completely imprisoned, even if they have 100,000 songs to sing. And I don't know how many times I'd find myself in situations in life where I just feel that endless distance from people that I could really communicate with that way. I mean, that's why the line comes to my mind. I don't have to think about it and for somebody who reads the Rumi in the Persian, that's something that's just absolutely natural. You don't have to be as immersed in it as Fatemeh was, but still anybody, and even in, I spent a lot of time recent years in Turkey, and people know the Turkish translations that way. They don't know Persian very much, but people know the equivalents. It's I remember having a Turkish student who was from that secularist Kemalist background and said, well, I don't know anything about Islam, but I said, well, just come to the class and we'll see. And then we were reading Yunus Emre, who's kind of the Turkish, almost contemporary, and very similar in the sense of his using popular language. And she said, "That's not religion. My mom has that in the calendar, in the kitchen." Well, that's real religion. That's Din al-Khalis. That's not not the stuff in the mosque, the madrasas, but Rumi functions that way. And so this has to do, I wanted to say, just for people listening in, this is my feeling about translations is I need translations in a classroom that reflect all of the depths of the poetry. But when somebody's in a bookstore or online, I wish people could, students can still browse in libraries. I wish we had more bookstores around, because the translations that are important are the ones that mark you and that you can't let go of and sit down. And dozens of people try to translate Rumi and they just don't catch. They've got the words, but they don't have that. It's very similar to Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. He's a poet. Oh, Coleman Barks was a poet and is a poet. And so when you're starting out, you want to follow your love, and you have to start with the poems that conjure up that depth. I just mentioned that because I can see that with students so often, that I always give them some poetic translation side by side with the hard stuff we're going to study, because you have to fall in love before you can really find the ishq, the hope, the dedication and love that will carry you into a deeper meaning of his poems.
Like in the Nename, it says, the song of the reed is not wind, it's fire. Whoever does not have this fire, get out of here, get lost.
If I may say this, Jim, I'm thankful for being immersed in this and all that, but it shouldn't really be seen as a privilege, because it gives you one particular perspective. The perspective of the one who comes to it from outside is as valuable and as important, if sometimes more important, because they can see and notice things that to them is new. So I am absolutely delighted. I'm thankful, because when I start reading this, I am in a different universe, and I can't be thankful enough for it. But I don't think even for 1 second that this is a kind of superiority or privilege. It's just a different perspective, and I'm obviously glad to share it. But that's I think how it should be seen. And so others who are coming into, particularly young and interested people, they should not feel that they're going to be totally disadvantaged because they come from a different culture. They're standing on the bridge. They're going to see a lot more in the water than the fish that is swimming in there. So, it has, each of those have their own great advantages.
And I just would emphasize that the rubaiyat, the quatrains of Rumi, which often, as with quatrains of many great Persian spiritual teachers and poets, they're not always necessarily by Rumi, but people would attribute them to Rumi. And for people from the outside and newcomers to Rumi, that's why I think Unseen Rain or Hidden Secrets, these first books of Coleman Barks were so effective and so powerful, as they really reflect that sense of discovery of a deeper truth that when you read them in the Persian then and closely, you say, wow, that's amazing. They actually caught, because the quatrain as a form, it's like taking something like the Masnavi and compressing a whole bunch of things into 4 simple lines. So there's a compression that goes on that when you try and explain it, you end up taking a whole lecture class just to explain one quatrain, but they're very effective as kind of a first approach to Rumi.
Can I give you a rubai, a quatrain? It's one of my most favorites. He says, در بحر صفا گداختم همچون نمک، نه کفر و یقین ماند، نه ایمان و نه شک. اندر دل من ستاره‌ای پیدا شد، گم گشت در آن ستاره هر 7 فلک. I melted in the sea of purity like salt. Nothing remained. Belief, disbelief, doubt, certainty, they all dissolved. And در دل من ستاره‌ای پیدا شد. A star appeared in the center of my chest. گم گشت در آن ستاره هر 7 فلک. The entire universe, the 7 what's falak? Spheres. Thank you. The 7 spheres disappeared in this one star. So, in these 4 lines, not only he gives that, he jumps into the sea of purity and he dissolves. Everything disappears, everything expands. Then everything comes together in that one star and brings the whole universe with it. So it's unbelievable what he does with this simple and really adorned, unpretentious language of his.
It's unbelievable. It's like a supernova and a black hole all in one in just a few lines. That's really remarkable. My own favorites have always been the ghazals of Divan-i Shams. The rhythm has just always intoxicated me, even though I've only studied Persian for a year, but I can read them and appreciate the rhythm. I wondered if you had any favorite ghazals of Rumi's that really do it for you. This quatrain was mind-blowing. Are there any ghazals from Divan-i Shams that are amongst your favorites?
Yes, there are. I have so many favorites. I would have a hard time to choose, but because of Nowruz, I did a recent translation of a poem which is about the transformation that the spring brings. So maybe I'll read that. خبرت هست که در شهر شکر ارزان شد. خبرت هست که دی گم شد و تابستان شد. خبرت هست که ریحان و قرنفل در باغ زیر لب خنده زنانند که کار آسان شد. Did you hear? Precious sweets are in every store, everywhere. The winter is gone, and soon the summer will be here. Basil smiles at carnation cautiously and whispers, the hardship is over. The winter is gone. Did you hear? خبرت هست که بلبل ز سفر باز رسید، در سما آمد و استاد همه مرغان شد. خبرت هست که در باغ کنون شاخ درخت مژده نو بشنید از گل و دست افشان شد. The nightingale arrived from his journey and started to sing right away, teaching birds of all feathers to do the same thing. Did you hear? The rose broke the news of the spring, putting her perfume in the breeze. The tree branches are so giddy, they have not stopped dancing since. خبرت هست که جان مست شد از جام بهار، سرخوش و رقص کنان در حرم سلطان شد. خبرت هست که لاله رخ پرخون آمد، خبرت هست که گل خواست بگ دیوان شد. Not just the trees, the souls are drunk with wine that the spring has poured in their cups. Now walking, now dancing on their way to the king's dwelling. The tulip ran to the palace too, blood pouring down her face from the winter's blow. Fortunately, the rose is close to the king. She will be there to tell him all he needs to know. خبرت هست ز دزدی دی دیوانه، شحنه عدل بهار آمد و او پنهان شد. بستدند آن صنمان خط عبور از دیوان، تا زمین سبز شد و با سر و با سامان شد. شاهدان چمن ار پار قیامت کردند، هر یک امسال به زیبایی 100 چندان شد. Better still, did you hear that December, the crazy thief, is hiding since the spring's prosecutors are talking to everyone in grief? The spring's blossoming beauties, on the contrary, are given free rein. They will be everywhere, making life vibrant and green again. Some say last year the flowers were a riot, peerless in exquisite beauty. Their charm is 100-fold this year. You have not heard? Come on out here and see.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you so much. It's really lovely. Speaking of news, I remember this one line from a ghazal. I think it was Zulfeto Shabe Qad Rast Urukheto Hame Noruz. Like your hair is Laylatul Qadr, night of destiny. Your face is a new day, is Noruz, the New Year holiday. How do you even think of a line like that? That's not. It's really amazing. Professor Morris, did you have any favorite poems, ghazals, or parts of the Masnavi? I remember we studied Moses and the Shepherd with you, and I know that was a favorite of yours.
Yeah, I think Rumi has this amazing gift for taking complex theological, mystical, spiritual ideas and putting them in the simplest imaginable, well, unimaginable almost forms. And I like the story of Moses and the shepherd, which is basically about the something I know he knew well, probably in himself and people around him, where people who have a very intellectual and conceptual understanding of religion tend, for better or for worse, to look down upon people who think in more, that's called tanzi, or transcendence of God. People who have to see things in terms of images and actual experience, tashbih or likeness of God. And of course, in that one, Moses is sort of scornful of this shepherd who's talking about God as being like one of his lambs that he's, comforting and taking care of. Also, by the way, that's another important thing, as though God is the actor and we do nothing. And of course, the shepherd doesn't see it that way. It's an interaction, which is central to the Quranic view of things. So that's one of the most famous ones, and it happens to be one that Shahram Nazari has, if you listen with his music and so forth, or a good reciter, it just deepens it all the more. But one quatrain that I still remember is kind of, well, let me just do the Persian quickly, and then the English is so dense, but to explain it. But it's "E dust badusti karinim Torah, harja kadam nahi zaminim Torah." Well, I'll translate those two bits and then come to the conclusion. But, oh friend, oh beloved, I'm joined with you through love. Dusti here is love, friendship. But so wherever you put your foot, I am the ground for you. So the idea here is being the ground for someone's foot is a fairly painful experience, no matter what age you are. So it's alluding to both the divine beauty, which draws us towards God, and the divine teaching, the bala and ibtila and testing and all that. When God steps on, another thing is in the hadith and things, God's 2 feet kind of represent the side of beauty and the side of majesty or whatever. So despite that, or through that painful experiences of life, our friendship and our love just becomes deeper and deeper. And then he asks us the third line of quatrains is always the punchline, if you will. It says, "Dar in mazhab ashiki raha ke bashad." How can it be that in this school of learning to love, mazhab, or in this pathway, mazhab he's using both the underlying meaning of the Arabic, this pathway of learning to love, which is life on earth, that we see the world through you, and yet we don't see you. Alam batobin, maybe I didn't say that. Batobinim, Navinim Torah. So, this sort of paradox of God is we're tied to God in every imaginable way, maybe tied to the beloved, to the dust, Al-Wali, not Al-Wali, I'm sorry, not Al-Wali, the divine name, the beloved. And So I like that one. It's a professor's favorite because you can spend a class explaining the meanings that are, in a way, the whole metaphysics, all the Qur'an is in those 4 lines. You pick up a collection or a translations of the quatrains, and they're all like that. I mean, in fact, the ones that are boring and exhortations and whatever, you look up what scholars say. Turns out they're not Rumi. It's just that people love to contribute their inventions to Rumi, but it's pretty obvious when he's not speaking there because his poems just have endless meanings.
And he has such a sense of humor as well, too. These stories from the Masnavi, like, a fly on a piece of straw. Like, what is he doing? He's like made a boat of a piece of straw in a puddle of urine, and he's going around thinking he's king of the world. I mean, you read that, you can never forget those images. They're kind of emblazoned in your head forever. Or the first Rumi I ever memorized was Man masto to devane maroke barad khane sadbar Torah goftam kam khordose pemone. I'm drunk and you're crazy, so who's going to take us home? I've told you 100 times, drink a few cups less, 1 or 2 or 3 cups less, it's a hilarious image. But like most really good humor, as you said, it's really profound. It captures these perspective shifts.
Yeah, I think if we were to really pick one characteristic, I mean, don't have to do that because there are multiple things, but I think that his characteristic is playfulness. He's playing. He is not up there on the pulpit, preaching. When you, feed your audience like a breastfeeding mother, you're down there with them. Or when you dance, when you whirl with them, or when you listen to music with them, you're down there. So it is, I think, the metaphor of children, of us being children going towards the mother being the divine. It's all about being together and playing together and enjoying things together, but also, as in the quatrain that Jim quoted, also the moments of learning. But the whole thing is so interconnected. Love is not there just to be a feel-good thing. Love is there to help you break yourself if you need to. He says that when the child is young, he's trying to explain this, he says, when a baby knows only how to drink milk and, how to, even as they grow up, babies just think about food and comfort and so on. Then they grow older, they begin to, their bodies grow, their minds grow, they begin to think about, the games to play, listening to stories and things, and grow older, think about other things. Then King Love comes and says, "This is too small a house for me. Break it down and build a palace." And so love is there. It makes you feel able and brave, but it's also there to be able to become the earth for the other one to step on, if that's what you learn from, in order to build the palace. So I think sometimes the students say, or some other people say, well, why so much love? We're not in a world where love is that important anymore, and so on. And I think they forget how complex is the love that he's talking about, which is about just countering life, facing life, and being there and being ready to rebuild yourself when you need to, no matter how painful that is.
Just building on what you've both been saying there, one thing I would recommend to people who are listening to this, or that I sometimes do to students, is most normal people don't have enough time to work their way through the endless number of ghazals, whatever translation you're working with, and especially the Masnavi. But one practice that people can do, and I notice they've even created books in English, kind of anthologies that allow you to do this easier, is what in the Islamic tradition is called istif'al, but sort of it's like same with the I Ching in Chinese or with Hafez in Persian, is to just have your favorite Rumi book there, and each day to sort of take a moment of meditation. You don't have to perform so many prayers. I mean, there are all sorts of official ways to do this, but just informally, and just whether it be in the morning when you get up or before you go to bed, just close your eyes, meditate, and open up that book and take in a short lesson, be it a story from the section from the Masnavi or be it one of the ghazals or so forth. That this practice is easy to do. It's always rewarding. I think with Rumi, if you're using a good translation, it's going to be rewarding. And it's a substitute but it's not really a substitute for classes or whatever. It's actually better because you're going to connect what's going on in your life with that particular point. Now, of course, people do this followed with either the Qur'an or with Hafez or whatever, but you can also do it with Rumi to great benefit. And the better the translation you have, the richer your experience will be.
No, thank you. I did that for a few years actually when I was first getting into Rumi, without even knowing anything about the fall tradition. And just as you said, Rumi comforted me, but also, as you were saying, love for Rumi is not just some kind of like new agey good feeling thing. It's pain, it's suffering, and it's death. But as he said, when has death ever made me anything less? For me, Rumi was really important in my own transformations and kind of helped guide me through my own transformations and understand the pain and all of the things that are necessarily a part of that, while at the same time making me laugh and giggle. And he's been a wonderful friend and teacher.
And now you have kids to do the same thing for you.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Speaking about being stepped on. Yeah, every morning they come and jump. There's no playground like daddy playground. We even have a daddy slide game. I lie down still like plank and they slide down me. So there's nothing like kids to teach you about love. That's wonderful. Well, we're drawing to the end of our time together, but I wanted to leave with kind of two questions. We've already spoken a little bit about what Rumi has to say about poetry itself and how it works, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to say anything more about what Rumi has to say about poetry itself, the power of poetry, how it works, how it can do things in ways that prose cannot. And we spoke about its connections on music, and these kind of ritual movements can take you places that you can't really get to any other way. And it seems like poetry for him is kind of, you can get places with poetry that you can't get with just kind of ordinary speech. And then to conclude, would like to talk about kind of Rumi's legacy today, the contemporary legacy. But I wanted to give you a chance if there's anything else you wanted to say about what Rumi has to say or tell us about the power of poetry.
Well, I think that he was very aware of the fact that the aspect of religious thought that might look down at poetry, that might see it like, going back to the verse Ashu'ara yatabahum al-ghabun, and even he himself refers to his life in Khurasan, that velayat ma sha'iri nang bud, or that in my own hometown where I grew up, being a poet wasn't really an honorable thing. Partly, as Professor De Bruyne points out, probably he's talking about poets in courts where their job was praising power, basically. There's elsewhere where he's talking about قافیه اندیشم و دلدار من گویدم مندیش جز دیدار من. I think about rhymes and how to put this together. And my beloved says, don't think about anything else but me. So there are all kinds of things, aspects of poetry that he wants to make clear, that then when he speaks about Sukhan and how important Sukhan is, he's not talking about those things. And then he basically tells us in multiple places that when he speaks, there is an inner core. There is a simple way, it's not to go with the artistic or technical aspect of putting this together, but it's the inner, like ذکر موسی بحر روپوش است لیک نور موسی نقد توست ای مردنی. Speaking about Moses, it's just the cover, it's the light of Moses that you should be going for. And then he talks about, موز قرآن مغز را برداشتی. And, پوست را پیش خران انداختیم, because some say it's not his, but I actually don't see it as disrespectful at all, that he says, I take the inner core of the Quranic message. The cover, the shell is not important. And نور چشم خود نور دل است. نور چشم از نور دلها حاصل است. So the light of the eye comes from the light of the heart. And نور دل نور خداست. So the idea is to get to this inner light, which is the light of God. صورت از معنی چو شیر از بیشه دان یا چو آواز و سخن زندیشه دان. It's like the بیشه, the thicket is not important. The lion in there is the purpose. So when you see that and combine it with همزبانی خویشی و پیوندی است, which we read earlier, to be able to speak to each other. So that kind of speaking to each other is really important to him. And he sees the words and the language very powerful. But, I think that a whole article, if not book, could be written on the concept of sukhan for Rumi. Because he says all kinds of things. He says, I come here and I try to say things because I want to entertain the people around me. I want them happy. Somewhere else he says, سخن منقاد من نمی شود. I don't want to speak, but the words want to come out. So it's a very, very complex approach to the idea of speaking, which I think he loves, as long as that doesn't become an art of playing with the intricacy of language and showing your power, how you can do it. But go for the light of the light inside it, which the language can carry for us.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Professor Morris, anything you'd like to add?
Well, it's implicit in much of our discussion, but I think in the world today, we need Rumi, what Rumi has to contribute in so many different ways. That's his popularity, which is pretty global by now. I think as soon as some translations in there, people get turned on, as they say, to Rumi from a whole bunch of ways. If people have some kind of religious background and training that's important to them, Rumi deepens that and enables us to communicate and to learn better to communicate that to other people. So it's a deepening of whatever tradition. You won't read, say, the Psalms in the Bible the same once you've read Rumi, because, you don't have to study how the Hasidim or the this or that religious order read them, because Rumi is coming from a very similar place. So he gives us the tools we need to communicate with people from those different traditions. But more and more people in the modern world are so busy doing, well, we'll call them distractions, that Rumi, and they think of what people used to call religion, or still do, as being alien or even more negative. I won't go into the ways, but you see it in the classroom when first year students come up. Suddenly, Rumi, he touches, as great poets do, he's not alone in that, but he touches the deepest spiritual dimensions of our being. Also, I would just want to mention a couple more down-to-earth practical things. It's very easy these days to go to Kunya, and the visitation, actually people do pilgrimages in all sorts of forms. They can be literary, but you don't have to go there on his celebration day of December 17th, although you sure meet a lot of interesting people if you show up in Konya at that time. But there's a mosque there that is supposedly it's the mosque where maybe Shams was buried or whatever, but it's an amazingly powerful spiritual place to visit. So whenever you go there, don't just go to the museum, because that's like any museum. It's kind of, museums are dedicated to what's dead and gone. But a really powerful place is the Mosque of Shams there. I always, when I took students in pilgrimage visits, that's where we would go. So I would mention that. Yeah, I just think it's inexhaustible, and it's kind of like Shakespeare or Plato or people like that. When you start reading them and you go back to them and you say, why was I wasting my time reading so much junk or watching, streaming so much junk? And the other thing I have to say is we could have talked about, as I think Fatemeh mentioned at the beginning, it would make, you would think, a tremendous film or a tremendous story, introduce Shams and Rumi and their story and the whole, his father and everything. But that hasn't happened. And I think it's largely because I know people have tried, friends have done scripts for that, and people are going to finance movies. And I think because the words themselves are so much more powerful than the story you could tell about them, that at best all they can do is introduce an audience to actually reading the poetry. So you, as with the other poets in this series you're doing, their influence begins and ends with good translators, with good interpreters. You could say even with good performers, because many in Persian, if you listen to a good musician, or I've got some Ahmed Shamlu reading some of these poems, you don't have to know Persian. It's just like knocks you out, it's just a good reciter or a good performer. So all those are just suggestions for people to overcome the sense of estrangement and isolation and meaninglessness that so many people have inside them as they traverse this testing place. So the need is there and the resources are there. So we're all we're the mediators.
If I may, I think, Jim, you're pointing to something so important about going back to the poems. Sometimes people wonder why, say, Persian speakers or others who learn Persian later on have a quatrain or have something that is there and they keep going back to it. And they assume that this is like a piece of, prose that you read about some information, you get the information and that's done. No, with this, Rumi, in fact, says if you read something and you didn't feel that you can quite grasp it, come back next year and you be surprised, because you may be able to do that. And so, because so much of it happens in you who take that poetry in, which now, we give the fancy name of reception and, who people receive poetry and so on. But he said it, 835 years ago. He said, you come back to it. The way you have changed makes you understand this in a new light, in a different way. And so having those access to those texts in the original or in translation, it's, I think, the treasure. And that is why he's such a best-selling poet. He's been a best-selling poet, by the way, in English for a long time now, and in many other cultures, because, you can go back to those poems again and learn new things and see them in new lights. Because you're different. You're new every time.
What you've said there reminds me so much of amazing ayah in the Qur'an, which alludes to this, where it says, whenever you hear something that comes directly from haq, from the truth, you see people's eyes filled with tears from what they recognize of the truth. And that's not tears of sadness, that's tears of exaltation, of suddenly realizing a reality that is bigger than us, that gives direction and meaning and shines a spotlight on our life. And good translations of Rumi have that quality of really just bringing tears to your eyes.
No, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time with us today, Professor Morris, Professor Keshavarz. We know this is just a little drop, a little teardrop of the ocean of Rumi's poetry, often called the Bahr-e-Marifat, the ocean of recognition. So thank you for spending your time with us and introducing us to these manifold wonders of Rumi's poetry.